Okay, welcome everyone at today's panel discussion. This event is co-organized by the New Professionals Interest Group of American Society of International Law, and this is the closing event of the Early Career International Law Academia Symposium hosted by Opinio Juris and Afronomicslaw. My name is Barbara Bazant. I'm a PhD student at ASIL Law School in Budapest, Hungary, and I serve as the co-chair of the New Professional Interest Group. I believe I speak for most of us junior scholars when I say that the symposium touched upon a topic, or rather several topics, much awaited to be discussed more openly. And when reading the articles, we could easily identify with the challenges described therein. Today's event features several authors of the symposium with whom we will reflect on the broad issues discussed in the articles, and we'll discuss some of the most relevant questions early career researchers might wake up and go to bed with during their everyday lives. Let me now briefly introduce our panelists today, after which the conveners of the symposium will give their short introductory remarks, and then we will start the panel discussion. I also note that we also scheduled time at the end of the panel to have some audience questions. Therefore, I encourage everyone to note any questions which you might have during the discussion and enter them into the Q&A function down below. And we will have time at the end to ask our panelists about them, or if they fit during our discussions, we will incorporate them during. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. Unfortunately, due to personal reasons, Professor Tuwala will not be able to join us today, but here we have with us another convener of the symposium. So we are happy to have Yulia Mtseva, who is a research fellow and a PhD candidate at Max Planck Institute for Comparative Public and International Law, and was recently a scholar in residence at the NYU Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. Yulia received an LLB from American University of Central Asia, an MA in Human Rights from Yerevan State University, and an LLM from Notre Dame Law School. Her main fields of research include public international law, international human rights law, transitional justice, and international humanitarian law. And Yulia was one of the conveners of the symposium, as I mentioned. We also have with us today Professor Ilayev Liblich. Ilayev is a professor of law at Tel Aviv University's Faculty of Law. He earned his JSD and LLM from Columbia Law School and an LLB from Hebrew University. He teaches, researches, and extensively publishes in public international law and humanitarian law. He's also the general editor of the Yearbook of International Humanitarian Law, and his two-part article in the symposium concerned methods in international legal scholarship. We have on our panel Professor Friedrich Maigret. Friedrich is a full professor and William Dawson Scholar at McGill University and the co-director of McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism. He holds a Bachelor of Laws degree from King's College London and a PhD from the Graduate Institute in Geneva and Panthéon-Sorbonne in Paris. His work focuses on the theoretical dimensions of international law, international criminal law, human rights, and the laws of war. And he extensively published, among others, with Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press. And his article in the symposium was about being a foreign legal academic. Our next speaker is Tejas Rao. Tejas Rao is currently a research assistant with the Bennett Institute for Public Policy at the University of Cambridge and an associate fellow with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. He completed his LLM in international law at the University of Cambridge, prior to which he studied arts and law at the Gujarat National Law University. His research studies the process of international environmental lawmaking with specific emphasis on norms governing the global commons and the legal status of epistemic communities. And last but not least, we have Raghavi Vishwanath. Raghavi is a PhD researcher at the European University Institute and the senior research associate at the Public International Law and Policy Group. She has a Bachelor of Civil Law from Oxford University, an LLM from Leiden University, and an LLB from National Law Institute University, Bhopal. Her research areas are cultural rights, international criminal law, human rights, and TWIL. And the article by Tejas and Raghavi discussed the complicated issue of social media within academia, and specifically that of Twitter. Now, we are very happy to have you all. And after the introduction of our speakers, let me yield the floor to the conveners of the symposium, or two of the conveners of the symposium, Yulia Mtseva and Barry Sender, Assistant Professor of International Justice at Leiden University, Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, to share their introductory reflections ahead of our panel discussion.
Right. Okay, I'll go first because Yulia is a panelist as well. So I'll just be very quick. I just wanted to say a brief hello to everyone and welcome you all. Thank you to the ASIL New Professionals Interest Group. Thank you to all the panelists, and thank you to such a brilliant audience that we have today. I think we've got almost 70 people in attendance, which is wonderful. I just wanted to say, the aim of, putting together the symposium, what we aim to achieve was really to enhance the conversation around issues which we felt were very much neglected on, assisting and helping early career academics in our field. And, while this is a closing panel for that particular contribution, it's very much not the end of this conversation, right? Far from it. There are many positionalities and issues that we didn't have a chance to confront during the symposium. And it's been great to see the conversation already continue, not only on Twitter, but also Opinio Juris's recent symposium on systemic racism and sexism in legal academia. So, although many challenges remain, I personally am hopeful that we can build from conversations like this to work together to improve our field for the better, because, this is important work. And we look forward to, many more conversations like this. But welcome and thank you to everyone.
Thanks, Barry. And a couple of words from my side as well. First of all, I'm very sorry that Dina is not able to join us. So I'm here as a replacement. I know what a bummer, but please don't leave the meeting. I promise it will be interesting anyway, because we have other excellent speakers here. And just to say that the symposium for me was also such a revelation, because I learned so much, because I was maybe the only ECR among the conveners, and I'm very, very thankful for Barry, Dina, and Srinivas to inviting me to work with them, because it was such a great experience. And I'm very happy to see that it resonated with a lot of you. I mean, not happy that it resonated, but happy that it helped you to reflect on some of the issues. So just wanted to publicly thank Barry, Dina, and Srinivas for all their work and for all their ideas. And of course, all of our contributors who spent their time and so kindly and genuinely shared their contributions with us. And I think from here, back to you, Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much for your introductory remarks, and let's jump right into the questions. So one of the motivations behind launching the symposium was to uncover unspoken parts of public international law academia. So first, I would ask all the panelists to reflect a bit on how they got to their current stage of career, and as such, to reflect a bit on the challenges of this path, whether you personally run into any unforeseen or unpleasant barrier during this career path, and what you consider to be the biggest challenge for especially an early career researcher. And we can go in any order you like. Aliyev, maybe.
Me?
Yes.
Okay, so first of all, thank you everyone for participating, and thanks for the organization of this symposium. I think it's helpful not only for ECRs, but for all of us. Regarding the question, first of all, we mentioned positionality. So in terms of personal barriers, so I'm lucky enough to be pretty privileged in the sense that I don't think I can spot a single personal challenge in that sense, but I would probably leave to others to reflect on that. But I did run into challenges as an early career researcher, and I think, all ECRs run into similar challenges. Of course, personalities matter, institutions matters, background matters, privilege matters, but everyone runs into similar challenges, of course, on a different level of intensity, maybe. So I think early on, you kind of run into challenges about how to manage your career in several aspects. So first of all, there is how to manage your time, right? So you finish your PhD or your postdoc when you're kind of a free agent, and then suddenly you are in an institution and you have, a lot of constraints, teaching, research, administration, and suddenly you have somebody that you're accountable to in that sense. So this is one challenge. The second is managing students. And I'm not saying teaching specifically, but students. So nobody trains you to deal with young, anxious, inexperienced people that have their own problems and challenges. And I found it's quite overwhelming in my first years to kind of find out how to manage my relationships with students. And you would find early on that teaching is kind of, I don't want to say a lose-lose endeavor, but not everybody would be happy, or many people would be unhappy with you, whatever you do. Too much reading, not enough reading, not enough PowerPoints, too many PowerPoints. You're going to run into, and that's the easy parts. The third challenge is managing colleagues. So as an early career researcher, you would have to kind of get along with your colleagues. I don't know if it's a huge surprise to everyone here, but not everybody in academia is easy to deal with. So you would have to kind of find out how to, find out your peer group and who can be in your peer group, and kind of avoid people who are less positive. And you would have to conduct yourself in faculty workshops and contribute to the intellectual life in the faculty. So this requires a lot of kind of sensitivity and awareness. In terms of research, I think what I found to be the most challenging in the first part of my career is kind of getting control of your research agenda. You're going to get a lot of, I don't know if a lot of it, you're going to get invitations, people are going to ask you for things, and you're going to find yourself kind of contributing to a lot of things. Some of them are good and interesting and you won't regret it, but you're going to have to find your own voice. What is interesting to you at a certain point, and of course, what methods and theories are interesting. And this is not obvious, I think, to anyone. And sometimes it's not something you can plan ahead. You will just run into something which would be interesting, and then you would find your voice. But that I also found challenging. And last, and increasingly so, is how to manage your visibility, how to get your stuff out there. There's a lot of scholarship. The field is crowded and competitive. So you kind of find a way, maybe through blogging, through social media, through colleagues that you get to know, but to get your stuff noticed. So that to kick it off.
Maybe we can go with Frederick now, and then it would be interesting to see how the others reflect on these.
Sure. Well, I won't add to some of the great comments that Elia already made. That matches my own experience. I don't think I was quite privileged in the sense that I didn't encounter any sort of massive structural barriers, although crossing the Atlantic was a barrier in itself, and a bit of a scene change, having been trained pretty much mostly in Europe, and then to have a career in North America turned out to be quite challenging. Maybe it was a little easier in Canada than it would have been in the US, but there's a lot of cultural adaptation. And one of the things I caught myself doing early on is I would teach my Canadian students the way I had been taught in France and the UK, and that did not go down very well. So I had to quickly adjust. You generally get the message. The nice thing about an early career, and there's lots of nice things about being in an early career, is you're still very agile, and you can switch 180 degrees if you need to. It's all very experiential, and you do have a bit of time to just try things around. It's not all set in stone from the start. So I won't comment at length on how I got where I am, but I would maybe emphasize the importance the element of chance. So, you know, however much you work, however much, you know, you publish, etc., there's still always something that's a bit irreducible. I mean, just when I say chance, I don't mean just for lottery, but also who you meet and, you know, where you end up being at what time. Particularly when it comes to recruitment, I've chaired and been on recruitment committees for a long time now. And, you know, universities have particular needs at particular moments, right? You might have a fantastic CV, you know, great publications, you know, they just need someone to teach contract law and you're not that person. So I say that because people do get a bit despondent if they're rejected, and it does take a toll on morale, but you think of it as not a kind of referendum on your worth, but as a fit issue, right? There's a strong fit element. You know, I've seen this at McGill many times that, you know, no one really knows what academic excellence is in the abstract, but people have a good sense of who they would want to have as a colleague down the corridor, and, you know, someone they can interact with, someone who brings new ideas to the table. And it's going to be quite different from one institution to the other. There's all kinds of dynamics in the background, you know, that people in recruitment committees say, well, but don't we need, you know, one more person sort of, you know, who studied this or who could connect to, you know, this or that colleague. So all of that is beyond your reach. I would say, though, that chance kind of happens. You have to encourage it a bit. So being out there, you know, there's something nomadic about our profession, and it's worth engaging that nomadism and being in different scenes and you know, being seen a bit. You know, I do see this quite a lot, that whenever I've been on recruitment committees, you know, that having heard of people, having read them, having, you know, if there's a bit of a buzz, that, you know, that definitely helps. Challenges briefly. So, you know, there's, you know, the whole career is a bit of a challenge, but certainly in terms of the early challenges, I remember, one of them is they don't tell you how big teaching is, right? So there's this paradox that we are entirely trained or mostly trained to do research. We are then mostly selected based on our potential for research, and then evaluated further down for tenure and promotion on a basis largely of research. Still, what we do most of the time, most days, is teach, supervise, etc. And it's just very weird, right? We're not really trained to do it. Most of us are kind of pedagogical skills are sort of, you know, I think something that we make up as we go. So don't underestimate that, you know, if, like, your first few years are going to be spent doing a huge amount of preparation, reading, you know, developing syllabi, etc. And so my advice is make that work for your research, right? Keep it fun and stimulating by ideally teaching things that play to your strengths, but also that kind of force you to research areas that you wouldn't have researched otherwise. Like, I'm basically assigning myself my students' readings, right? I mean, and I have to do them, and that's kind of fun. A second challenge is, and that, I mean, for you, many will have taken that turn already during their doctoral studies, but it's the kind of culture switch from being a student to being a professor, right? So, you know, there was all these people I looked up to when I was a doctoral student, etc. And the minute you become a professor, it's a fairly horizontal world, right? And you don't really get, I mean, you get occasionally mentors in your first years, but you're kind of basically on your own. And so there's no one, you know, you're sort of really the captain of your ship, and you don't get a lot of feedback. You know, if there's not, well, you're a colleague, right? You know, yeah, you just publish your articles, and for years you don't really know whether, you know, you have few indications, right, for whether you're hitting the right marks. You can obviously solicit colleagues to get input, but and then students look up to you, however much you think, oh, well, you know, I'm barely a professor. I'm really only a, I still think of myself as a student. They already invest you with sort of weird authority, which takes a bit of time to get accustomed to, and you want to sometimes resist, right, to not create artificial barriers. And maybe I'll just finish with suggesting, so one of the most difficult things in an academic career is choosing, I've already mentioned this, so sort of picking your fights. I'm very bad at this, so this is kind of, advice to self, really. But so I think there's different kinds of careers and different kinds of scholars, right? I mean, we have one model is based on kind of single focus, kind of strategic vision, right? So like, this is where I want to be in 5-10 years, and I want to have written, this or that book, with a model of sort of building expertise, let's say, in 1 or 2 core areas and never straying, beyond that. There's a model that is more of maybe an alternative, which is more that you're a scholar in the city, in the world, and you meet people, and there are encounters and opportunities, and you react to those, because a lot of the spark that makes, intellectual life is kind of encounters, right? Things, people you'll have met in conferences, you've had discussions with. Now, you can sometimes you can resist these encounters and say, well, this is very interesting. It's clearly not what I'm doing. Sometimes you can be tempted by them, and one thing leads to another. And so, and there's an element in all of this, I think, which is also important, is, the extent to which one works for one's core mandate and for oneself, and the extent to which one works for the community. So the community is always making demands on you, because you published something 10 years ago and they want you to contribute a chapter in a handbook, etc. So, early on, my advice, Jenny, resist those a little bit, although they're tempting. But later on, it's part of what you owe the field sometimes, like you have to do this because you want to collaborate, you want to help people, etc. So that's another thing, how much individual scholarship to collaborative scholarship. I'll just finish with this to say we're an exceptionally non-collaborative type of scholar. I mean, we do our best, but compared to the hard sciences where people routinely, or economics, or even social sciences, where people sign articles with 6 or 8 other peers, 95% of legal production is still single authored. And I think that's something also to think about. I mean, early career is maybe not the best moment to do joint authorship, because it takes a lot of time, and it doesn't count for full publications. You want to be a little careful, but later on, I think it's a natural and productive move to want to do more stuff with others. Thank you.
Thank you. I would turn to Julia, Rakavi, and Tejas, and ask you what your challenges you faced are, and how you would reflect on the challenges which were shared by Fred and Elia. Julia, maybe you can start.
Yeah, I will be just very, very brief and start with the answer of how I got where I am now. And just to echo Fred, that he said that there is always an element of chance, right? You should be in the right place, in the right time. That's what happened to me as I used to think about it, because when I was applying for my PhD, I didn't know what a PhD is. I just saw 4 years paid, right? That's for me. And this relates to the first challenge that I wanted to discuss, and the challenge is not knowing the peculiarities of the field that you're entering. And this was really hard for me. Also, not only like the peculiarities, but also internal dynamics that are inherent to the field, and also their structures. It was very challenging for me to be the only one in the room not knowing like the names of the authors whose work we are discussing, for instance, or how a peer review process works, or how to submit an article, or what is expected from you with regards to your academic output. It's also what Fred said. Do you say yes? Do you say no? What do people expect from you when you are doing your PhD, or maybe even slightly after, when you are done with your PhD and when you're wrapping up with your PhD? So I think all these questions are, of course, very individual, right? It's just my experience, and there is no answer to them. But I wish I was better prepared for my experience. And this also relates to the second point that I want to mention, why I was not aware of the things, right? Because nobody told me how the things work. And I don't expect people to tell me how things work, but during the reflection process, I just realized that nobody told me, because I was not in the circles where I could learn this. And maybe it also relates to the fact that I didn't go to a top school where people are talking about the things, like, in Oxbridge, where the biggest publishers are, for instance, located. I think people know there how, like, for instance, a peer review process works. So unfortunately, as much as we want these challenges not to be true, right? This elitism, classism in our field, and that we are like arguing that it shouldn't be the case, I still feel that this is the case, especially when trying out new things, applying for new things. This unfortunately still plays a role. And my point here is not that drop everything and try to go to a top law school. No, my point is that exactly this kind of spaces as we're having now, we should use them to talk about this. And the more we talk, I think the more awareness we raise, and the more chances there are to actually finally challenge this practice. I guess that's all I wanted to say. So I'm looking forward what Tejas and Raghavi have to share with us.
Thank you. Raghavi?
Sure, thanks. Firstly, I think I'd like to thank everyone in this new professionals interest group for putting this together, and also Dina, Barry, Yulia, and Srinivas for the symposium. So I think part of why I'm so thankful that this happened has got to do with how I got into aspiring to be an international law academic. So I trained in India, and I think I trained at a time when international law was not all that popular, and definitely pedagogical methods in relation to international law teaching were not all that known or popular. So you had to self-teach yourself international law by doing moot courts, which is somehow a trajectory that lots of us followed. And now I've spent, I think, 3.5 years trying to navigate academia in Europe as a migrant. So lots of, I think the journey hasn't been particularly rosy, and lots of this has got to do with my personal characteristics. So the fact that I had to incur massive debt when I did my master's, or the fact that I had to do unpaid internship after unpaid internship, or try and explain to my family that this is something you should believe me, that there's a future waiting to be found here, right? That nobody else had pursued this sort of career path in my family, and it is still quite bizarre to my family that I'm doing this, and they really do not understand what I do on a daily basis. So explaining that to them is also quite a challenge. And I think that really what has helped me float so far is finding peers, finding friends with whom I can rant, and symposiums like this where you realize, where you're reassured that many others are facing similar issues. It's so cathartic to hear from people and to find that these problems are shared, and perhaps there are solutions which can also be shared. In terms of challenges, I think there are lots of challenges. Perhaps the whiteness of academia is a big challenge, which I don't think I'm competent enough to offer solutions for, but I do experience it on a daily basis, so I must mention that it is a challenge. But the second challenge which I've regularly encountered is that of funding. And this has to do, I think this maps on somewhat to what Yulia also said about knowing about opportunities which exist. And I must at the outset already state that I speak from a position of privilege, because my PhD does give me a monthly grant, but that when you enter a PhD with the assurance that you have that money, and then you find out, no, there are actually a zillion other things that I need money for that I do not know where to get this money from. Whether it is doing field work. So for instance, my PhD has a central fieldwork component, and I do not know where to find the money to fund fieldwork, or funding translation services during fieldwork, or funding conference visits, or even funding visa applications. I think the time and the effort that goes into finding funding for each of these things that are considered protocol or that are considered normal features of academia is not spoken about enough. And I struggled a lot to find funds, and also to speak to people who know where to find these funds. And that's a continuing challenge. I think the more we speak about it, the more we realize how endemic the problem is. The second challenge, which also maps onto, I think, what Fred said, is this idea of brand name. And I say this because I think a lot of premium is still placed on brand name, and this often perpetuates a rather toxic culture where you incur lots of debt, you invest a lot of money in an institution or in a person because of their brand name, and because of the promise that it will carry you through for the rest of your life. And in most cases, that promise doesn't really stick through, because academia is just so competitive now. So I wish more people spoke about how to evaluate the real value add of an opportunity, or a collaboration with an institution, or a collaboration with an institution or a person, without allowing the brand name to completely overpower that decision-making process. And that I find very challenging still, and I wish that we spoke about it more. And the final thing would be, at least a challenge that I often grapple with, is this idea of high quality. And I know that Yulia also tweeted about this recently, but just the fact that you're expected to produce supposedly high quality material all the time. And oftentimes, at least for early career researchers, you're left thinking that, okay, I have to wait for this moment of extraordinary productivity, extraordinary scholarship that is going to come out of me. Let me save myself for my best. And in this process of saving yourself, you lose touch because you're not writing enough. And when you read scholarship that you're citing, you realize not all of that is premium quality. And you're left wondering why I was saving myself for so long. So perhaps we should normalize this idea of high quality output all the time, and allow ourselves, cut ourselves some slack to produce mediocre content, because it might just be high quality for someone else. And that's a challenge that I also often grapple with. I haven't found solutions, but I thought it was important to articulate it.
Thank you, Raghavi. Tejas?
Thanks very much, Barbara, and thank you to everyone. I think I echo Raghavi's thanks for not only the symposium, but also this platform to talk about the kind of issues that early career researchers face. I'll first address how I got to where I am, where I currently am, and then talk a bit about certain issues that have come both as a result of something that I see as structural and something that I see as personal. First off, I think in the early career stage, in that I've not started my PhD as yet. I'm going to be entering my PhD. So this is the first time that I've been able to self-identify as an international law academic. And that I think is an important qualifier about who gets to be an international law academic and call themselves a part of the academy versus who is excluded from conversations about what the academy is and what the academy aspires to be is an interesting question. So being included within this symposium and being a part of a space like this is really helpful for careers who are for researchers who are on the gig economy or who are pre-doctoral, producing research output that is contributing to academic thought and within the academic fraternity. So that's where I'm coming from. That's my positionality when it comes to these things. But first, I think that I echo everyone's thoughts in terms of funding and information asymmetries. But I think it's not just it's not just about the kind of information asymmetries that exist with respect to opportunities, but it's also the information asymmetries that exist with respect to the zeitgeist and being able to point to what the academic moment is, where the funding is going, for example, or where funding pipelines are pointing towards, that there's a lot of gap in terms of the information that's provided to outsiders and people who are not within the circle. And I've been fortunate enough to be, like, I think very similar to Yulia, just in the right place at the right time, where that's enabled me to become involved with individuals who can point me to the zeitgeist, who can point me to the fact that, for example, my PhD proposal from the last year would not have secured funding anywhere because there's no momentum for it at the institutions I was applying to, or they were caught in a different academic moment. So perhaps I should be applying to different institutions altogether to secure funding, which I think is an important part of the kind of conversations that we need to be having. And I think in a way that might also take away from the tokenism that's offered to institutions that are considered elite. By having conversations about the fact that different institutions are situated in different academic moments and support different kinds of academic thought, I think we can really diversify the conversation around the kind of academic output that we produce in the first instance. The second bit, I think, that was a challenge and that continues to be a challenge is accepting the idea that a career within the International Legal Academy is a non-linear career. I had this very rosy picture. Similar to Raghavi, I trained in India, and my interest in international law and in research questions around international law come from moot court competitions and from a lot of time devoted to that. And when I pictured what the International Legal Academy was, it was a place where the minimum entry qualification was a PhD. And so because I wanted to research and teach, my only career thinking was, how do I get to finish my PhD in the fastest possible manner to be able to research and teach for myself? Which portrays this very linear path of finish your LLB education, finish your LLM, gain entry into a PhD, do the PhD, and then you can do what you want. And I assumed at the end of my undergraduate education, when admissions questions asked, where do you see yourself in 5 years? My answer to the master's question was doing a PhD, and my answer to the PhD admission question was research and teaching. But it's important, I think, to recognize, and I've had this experience over the past 1 year where I've been doing research projects that are on a gig basis. I'm effectively a consultant or a freelance researcher affiliated to institutions where they require it. So I'm on very fixed term contracts. But recognizing that it's not necessary that you're going to finish your PhD immediately, but you can continue to produce research output along your journey and continue to develop your academic voice, your non-academic voice, as well as produce academic and non-academic literature along the way is, I think, an important realization. And that's a particularly difficult realization for someone who, on a personal characteristic, is someone who's always, Fred pointed to two kinds of routes that you can have in terms of strategic vision and 5-year, 10-year plan, and having a more opportunity-oriented vision towards planning a career. I think it's a difficult task to accept that you're going to end up in a non-linear circumstance if you're someone who comes into the academy thinking that you need to have a 5-year vision or a 10-year vision. And academic institutions encourage that kind of mentality today currently. They expect you to have a clear sense of where you're going to be in 5 years or 10 years, when in reality, it goes all along the way, and you end up being able to research and teach after having grant rejections, proposal rejections, all along the way. And I think that that's a secondary important bit. And I think the last bit is, just to close off, finding a set of kindnesses. I don't think this is necessarily horizontal or vertical, but I think that it takes a lot of determination to enter the academy, to become an academic. I think it requires determination and like a genuine desire to learn more, a curiosity of some kind. But I think it takes a lot of kindnesses to keep you within the field. We've started to see a lot of early career researchers exit the academy and move to academically tangent institutions and produce academic output while being at policy institutions or public policy think tanks, for example, because of the kind of culture that pervades within the academy. And I think that to sustain so far, for me, what's been really helpful has been a circle of kindnesses, both vertically and horizontally. So from peers who are at the same stage of my career, and this was alluded to within the symposium pieces as well, but also from individuals who I've cold emailed and asked for advice, or even commented on someone's article after I've read it and heard back from them. And I think that really motivates you to keep on that train. So those kind of interactions probably help a lot. And that's my reflection on the academy.
Thank you, Tejas. I would quickly ask Fred and Aliyev to reflect on the second and third points of Tejas, especially about like the non-linear nature of academic career, and what kind of advice you would give to your younger selves or ECRs currently, because there is indeed a pressure, and many people leave academia because of that pressure, what Tejas was describing, and I'm interested in your point of view on Tejas's point, and also Julia's and Raghavi's, which really was similar to what they just pointed out. So Fred, maybe first.
So lots of good questions. So I think, it's a bit easy from my standpoint to say this, but my advice to my younger self would have been, go easy, sort of take more time to explore things. I was thrust into this North American culture that, imposed significant pressures in terms of publishing. I sort of embraced it with gusto, but there's a moment where you have to, you have to find your balance on the long term. And it's surprising. I mean, I think one of the keys is to remain interested, to remain curious, right? To not become jaded. And so that involves, there's a move towards kind of productivism and quantity over quality, etc. So I think it behooves all of us to resist this. It's harder though as an early career, because that's, these are the sort of validators of success. But a lot of our best work requires maturation. It requires us to slow down. So one thing that's helped me is, I've literally had some articles that I've developed over 10 years, I just go back to them every now and then just really hate them and leave them for another 5 years. And then a conference comes up and I think, oh, actually, this could be a good fit. And, so you kind of, it's like having a lot of balls in the air, you're juggling, and then a lot of the stuff goes to waste. Then sometimes you have something that it's just the right moment, right, for that piece, and that's what gives you the energy and kind of the wind in your sails to follow through with it. One thing that maybe a piece of advice, which I think is fairly important, is we tend to follow existing trends, especially earlier on, right? So, and there's a kind of fear of missing out, right? So, everyone is working on, I don't know, artificial intelligence right? I should, I should be doing this, etc. And the problem is, if that's already the thought, chances are you'll be playing catch up, and people will have already sort of cornered that area. But also, more significantly, I think a lot of the good research is research that no one is working on, right? So a good sign that you're onto something is that absolutely no one is interested, and your job is to make them interested in it, right? So now it's I'm dramatizing. It's never that simple, but really, we live in a very, I'm looking for the word in English, but in a field where everyone is following everyone. I mean, if you look at the number of articles on, I don't know, the ICJ's advisory opinion on nuclear weapons, I mean, there's like dozens, right? In no other discipline would that work, right? Because people say, well, no, that's been done. It's like if this were the hard sciences, how many treatments, right, of the same issue can you have? But it seems that we, especially when there's a big judgment by a big court, there's just no end to how many articles can be produced on that particular question. I think I'm really afraid that we're leaving out a million issues, right, on the side that have, particularly I'm speaking as an international lawyer, that have many more implications for people and, what the world is becoming, frankly. So I think to look away from these mega trends and to spot, tomorrow's trend and that, is really important. And I'm not saying this in a strategic way. I think it's also that what interests us is typically more idiosyncratic and more weird than these big mega trends, right? I mean, it might just be that we're really interested in, I don't know, artificial intelligence and the law or something. But chances are you're interested in some weird combination, and maybe you're being too modest about it. You're thinking, well, that's what interests me. I couldn't possibly claim to interest, a broader audience. But I think, in a sense, we create our fields, right? We don't just respond to existing ones. So follow your curiosity would be my, and your intuition about what's really important would be my advice.
Okay, so yeah, there are many points. Of course, I'm not going to be able to touch everything. But in terms of my advice to my younger self, I can relate to many of the things Fred mentioned. I would say, writing is pretty scary, right? So whenever you embark on a new project, there's this stage in which you're like, what the F am I doing, right? So just kind of embrace the scariness of research and don't stress about it, in the sense that you can kind of begin to kind of learn your own process. You kind of see again and again that you always go through this period in which you are kind of shooting in the dark. You're kind of lost. You don't know what you're doing. And if anybody tells you, well, I don't want to say anybody because, there might be a few people that do work that way, that they plan their research ahead and they have, this, very clear outline, and then they just sit down and just write everything as per the outline, and then voila, they have a paper. Most of the academics I know don't work that way. So you have an idea, right? And you have this preliminary outline, and then you write, and your mind takes you to other places, and you might have something that looks, on the same subject matter, but completely different. So kind of embrace this, right? Be less stressed about the fact that you don't know where your research is going. You just get up and you write a few things, and kind of things will, you will find your way. And after you kind of recognize this pattern after a while, and after a few years of experience, I would tell my younger self to trust this process. I would like to relate, also to the pressures. And I don't know, Barbara, if that's a separate question. But I think the pressure is increasing on people in their earlier stages. And part of what we discussed preparing to this conversation is this problem of inflation, in the sense that the feeling is that as you move on, the threshold for getting a job, or, what is considered successful, kind of becomes higher and higher. And I think, this is, I think it's correct. I think that we are seeing in the last decade or so a process in which every year the entry level becomes a bit higher. And of course, I don't know, Fred, if you mentioned, if you advocated, I think you mentioned that early career researchers cannot resist this, and I would certainly not advocate that anybody would resist right now. The threshold becomes higher. I don't care about that. I'm just going to keep on like nothing has changed. Probably that's not on early career researchers. I think, institutions and us within institutions have to kind of find a way, and it's not easy because it's bigger than one person, to kind of find a way to stop the madness. And so this is, but what I think ECRs can do is kind of, and that's also might be an advice to a younger self, is a lot about current academia is about learning to do good enough, fast enough. In the sense that everybody wants to get the perfect original piece out there, like I think Ragavi, I hope I pronounced her name right, mentioned, what about mediocre stuff? So I think you didn't mean mediocre in the bad way, but in the sense that, sometimes things are good enough and they can be publishable, even if they're not perfect, even if you're still, think that, you can go deeper, you can visit another archive, you can think about another theory, whatever. Sometimes you have to put a stop. You have to say, well, this is now good enough. And this connects to the thing with the threshold, because, and I think, counterintuitively, it's even, better for your mental health also, that you kind of like, okay, this is good enough, and let it go. So.
Thank you, Eliev. I would insert one of the audience questions, and I would encourage the audience to write as many questions as you can in the Q&A, because this question relates to what we just have been talking about and the pressure. So the question is, I have 10 years of practice experience. I'm told this fact not only hurts me with my PhD applications, but also with academic applications. What types of things can I do to get around this detriment? I know the answer is to publish, but I lack the environment and support that comes with being in a PhD program or an academic position. I would ask first Fred to respond to this question.
Okay. So, I mean, one of the ironies of all these application processes, we're increasingly asked to already upfront provide evidence of the very things that we're supposed to learn how to do in those programs. So, you already need to have taught before you go for a teaching job. You already need to have published before you do the PhD, and that's not great, and that's a fault. That's for us as faculty to work on. I mean, can I just say though that having chaired and been on recruitment committees, like, we know all this, and we resist it from inside as well. And I can tell you that there's just actually no straightforward correlation between number of publications and likelihood of being recruited. That's just not how it works, right? I think that's a bit of a myth. Not having any publications, definitely not a good thing. But having many banal publications, not great, no wow factor, right? So, everyone on the other side is reasonable and sort of trying to spot great future colleagues. But yeah, so look, I mean, it's funny because among faculty, right, traditionally having professional experience was definitely not a hindrance. I mean, North America, the model still seems to be, or until a couple of decades ago at least, was that, people who had clerked for senior judges and had worked for whatever justice or the State Department would get jobs without PhDs, and were generally, of course, encouraged to have PhDs if they wanted to. So I'm a bit surprised that this kind of is held against you, right, in applications. I mean, I think there is this weird thing, right, that sometimes what you ask in applications is to show how committed you are to a particular career trajectory. And so you kind of, again, need to have already done the things that you actually want the PhD to help you do, right? And so that I think is tricky, but and very hard to publish on one's own before one is part of a community. So I think that's also a very valid point. I could only encourage you to apply to maybe other doctoral programs that don't have these sorts of blinders.
Rakavi, maybe can you reflect on this a little bit, how you approached your PhD application and how you think about publishing before actually starting your PhD?
Sure. On the process of looking for schools, so I remember that when I did my first master's degree at Oxford, I applied to the MPhil program there. And like they just said, the idea was really 5 years PhD, because that's something I do need to enter academia. I applied to the MPhil there, and I realized that really I hadn't thought so much because I was so wedded to the idea of finishing the PhD, doing and then hopefully finishing the PhD. I hadn't thought so much about the contents of the proposal itself. So I took a year to ruminate over my proposal. And then that year also gave me the space to think about what I'm really looking for in the PhD. And that was the time when I realized that the specializations of each school and the specializations of available supervisors are quite key in the choice that you make. I think oftentimes, like I said before, you look for brand names, and that becomes a sort of smoke screen and doesn't allow you to critically judge what else the school is able to offer. So in terms of who's at the school, what are they currently writing, what are their research projects now, are these research projects aligned with the directions you want to go in? Who are the people who have come out of the school recently? Do you see them publishing in similar areas? Or what sort of networks, what sort of advice have you already received perhaps from some networks about these schools or about these supervisors in particular? I think those were important considerations for me. And something very, very important for me was the fact that I needed a funded PhD. I needed the ability to get rid of the debt I'd already incurred. So having that financial security was quite important for me, because I don't think I would have been able to handle multiple jobs and do the PhD on the side. So money and supervisory quality, facilities and mechanisms in this institution which foster supervisor-supervisee relationships were quite important for me when I was making the choice.
Thank you. We have another question. Most of the available opportunities in the international law teaching and research are based in Europe and North America. What advice would you have for practitioners and scholars based in the global South who want to be visible and get the same opportunities? Maybe since Tejas, you are doing research now in Cambridge, how did you approach looking for research places, and what kind of advice would you have?
Thanks for that, Barbara. And that's a very good question, but I think it's founded on the myth that, or the assumption that publicly visible international law opportunities are available in Europe and North America. There's a lot of opportunities to be involved in international law research and thinking within the geographical South that are now emerging, that also emerge with a completely different approach to what international law is. That I think is important to be acknowledged. And I think I think that there are two ways about thinking about this question, right? One is, do you want to be away from that system altogether, and therefore do you want to become visible to the European and North American networks? Or is it, do you want to stay within that, within the geographical South, become visible within the geographical South and take that scholarship forward? For me personally, I wanted to move away because I wanted to experience this side of thinking about international law, having been exposed to a little bit during my undergrad law school. And I had the opportunity to go back and teach at the National Law School in Bangalore in India recently, as I know Raghavi did as well. And most of us have been interacting with institutions within the geographical South that are trying to build capacity for international law academia and international law research opportunities. So in terms of trying to get visibility on this side, or try to understand what the academic market is like on this side, I was honestly helped by writing cold emails. A lot of my motivation to do the PhD, to do the research, was actually just a lot of cold emails and a lot of unpaid research assistantships, until someone paid me a stipend for some work that I did for them, which made me realize this was a viable career opportunity. It was a lot of unpaid work till a point where someone believed in the research enough to fund it for some time, and that helped out. In terms of opportunities that are available within those markets themselves, within markets that are not Europe and North America, I think that there's starting to be a lot more public advertisement of those opportunities. You look at what's happening with the University of the West Indies, for example, advertising opportunities there more publicly, more visibly, that being circulated. A lot of this breakdown of elitism of institutions that we are talking about over here is actively being done by advertising these opportunities to the same level to markets that did not have information about these altogether. So there's a lot, that imbalance of looking at opportunities within the geographical South as being somehow more demeaning to opportunities that are available in Europe and North America, I think is changing through conversation. And I think that people are recognizing that. So I would honestly just go back to what Priya Pillai has written in a previous article about international law careers in Opinio Juris, I think, where she says, do what you're doing and do it well, and things will work out. And I think, honestly, it's a bit of that. And if you want to stay in the geographical South and do that work well, you're going to get publicly noticed in that market or otherwise. But if you want to move over here, I think it's a little bit of cold emails trying to break into the network in addition to doing what you do well. And that will probably be the only bit of advice I can offer from my limited career experience.
Thank you, Tejas. We also have a question about prospective tenure track and prospective positions after finishing our PhDs. So I would first ask Julia what you think a couple of years already into your PhD, how you think about next steps, and then after Eliav about the other perspective or later perspective. And the question also asks about your particular countries, so feel free to reflect on your particular countries as well.
So I might just skip answering because I really want to hear what Eliav has to say about it. But just to add, like, what my plan is, right? And my plan is just to take whatever there will be at the point when I will be out of my PhD, because I don't have big expectations. And the big special thing I wanted to mention is, which relates to the question asked. For instance, in Germany, there are no opportunities for tenure track positions if you're a foreign educated lawyer. So I think maybe it's a good starting point already to know where you can't pursue a special career path. And I think it also helps me, maybe not even to better plan, but to better mentally set myself that, okay, it's not the country where I'm staying, or at least not where I'm staying in the capacity of an academic. Let's put it this way. So yeah, I think it's also important to scout around the peculiar criteria that the jurisdiction requires for you. And I think nobody can give you a universal answer because all jurisdictions are different. So I guess it's the thing that you should do on your own, or try to seek assistance from people working in these jurisdictions. But from here, yeah, Eliav, I think you have more to say.
I mean, not necessarily. I think I really second, Julia, what you said at the end. That I think it's a question that it's very hard to answer globally. I can say that if you look at the United States, things are very difficult if you're not educated in an American institution, especially if it's not an Ivy League institution. And then they have a very kind of particular track in which usually nowadays it's a bit different. Usually people would not get PhDs or equivalent to PhDs, but they would go into clerkships or into practice, and then they would publish while in practice, and then they would get a job. Nowadays in the US, more and more people are getting PhDs not in law. So in the US, you don't really have very, well, there are few, but not too many very well developed PhD equivalent programs in law. So a lot of people do PhDs in economics and, you know, humanities or other fields, and then they apply to law school out of the general point of view in the US scholarship is that you have to look at law from the outside. So if you have proficiencies in social sciences, economics, or any other extra legal field, philosophy, it would give you an edge. I think in Europe, I don't know too much. I mean, kind of my on the surface sense is, or before going to Europe, that people manage to get jobs in Canada. But Fred, you kind of can maybe counter that, and also in Australia and in the UK, I think it might be easier for people not coming from the country itself. I don't want to talk about my own country because it's a very small kind of market, so and I don't think it's that relevant in that sense. But it might be Fred that might describing correctly, the situation at least in the Anglo-American world.
So, I mean, it's really striking how national legal academia continues to be in most countries, but there's definitely a few outliers out there where not having been trained in the country is not a definitive obstacle. Although I should say it's still somewhat of a limitation, right? Because you won't have been socialized in the sort of legal mores of a country. They'll know from a get-go that it's unlikely that you'll be able to teach core courses for a while. It reduces, it's not all Canadian or all Australian universities that are amenable to, foreign recruits. It's those that have a kind of critical mass that allows them to have people teaching only international or only theoretical or methodological topics. So, but still, I mean, I think there's something there, and in terms of careers, I think the UK, Canada, Australia, also, to some extent, maybe the Netherlands or the Nordic countries. But I think there's also, then I always tell my students, you need to think much more globally, right? So I think there's, Chinese universities recruiting. There's a lot of universities in the Far East that sort of in South America, in Africa as well. So when I started these opportunities, it was just very hard to access. But we have Jindal in India, or Ditela in Buenos Aires, or National University of Singapore, or the American universities abroad sort of networks. I mean, there are opportunities beyond the usual suspects, and where, of course, one of the advantages, you can tap into rich energies, right? I mean, in some ways, this is where international law is happening, not in some of the sort of decaying capitals of the West, right? So I'm all for this kind of mobility and outlook. In fact, we need all mobilities. I mean, traditionally, we've had some north-north, quite a lot of south-north, but we need more north-south and south-south mobilities if we want to sort of rebuild some of the kind of political economic foundations of international legal academia.
Thank you, Fred. We have another question which concerns the fear of ECRs, that their ideas might get stolen. And I think it generally relates to what we might call imposter syndrome, where ECRs cannot decide when to consider themselves entitled enough to write an article. Why should other people listen to what they are writing on, when they should feel legitimate to teach other people on their subjects? So I would be interested in how you think about this question and about this phenomenon in general, both from a PhD perspective, who might currently go through this, and as a professor who might have faced this problem already. So maybe we can go with Julia. You'd like to jump in on that?
Yes, sure. Just want to clarify. I think the fear of stealing your ideas is different from the imposter syndrome. And I always think about people who think that their ideas will be stolen. I think they should be proud of themselves that their ideas are stolen. That means they are good. And but how to secure yourself from such a scenario? Yeah, I think it's a more institutional question. I think I can address this. I think because it's the institutions that have to take care of it, because they have to take care of their employers and their researchers. So yeah, I know some people who are scared of talking about their project because exactly of this, but I think it's not a good strategy, because in the end, then you publish a PhD, for instance, as a book, and nobody knows about this. about this topic. So I always think that it's better to kind of warm up your audience before you actually publish something bigger, like for instance, your thesis. But coming back to the question on the imposter syndrome and sharing my own experiences is how I deal with it. The first advice is probably be friend with your imposter syndrome and think about it as your neighbor who will always be there, but sometimes leave you when you have, like, you know, some achievements and something to praise yourself on. But there will always be moments when you're upset, when you doubt yourself, etc. So I don't think that fighting actively your imposter syndrome is something effective, because I haven't heard of any efficient strategies on how to do this. Maybe professional therapy, but yeah, that's what we should all maybe consider doing. And the second point, what really, really helps me is to talk about this to people. And because when you're open about this, you realize that there are so many of your friends, your colleagues are experiencing this, maybe not this to the same extent, maybe even more, maybe less, but it's just so relieving to hear that you're not alone in this journey. And yeah, it's just very relieving, I guess, when you talk to people, especially to senior people, about this. And I think we should stop shying away from this and saying that we doubt ourselves for something. I think being open is what will really help us to, going back to the first point, be friends with your complexes or with your syndromes or with the challenges you're facing, because you're not alone.
Rakhavi, maybe you have some insights on this?
Sure. I think I firstly just want to echo Julia. I couldn't have said it better myself. Really, I feel like my life moves from imposter syndrome to a deadline, an abstract deadline or a conference deadline. And it makes me realize that you don't really need to push back so actively. There are some challenges which don't need to be solved. It's okay. You can live with your imposter syndrome, but also reconcile yourself to the fact that everybody is going through the same thing in varying degrees, and that it's healthy sometimes to not be too confident of yourself. Perhaps that's a reality check as well, to think about keeping yourself grounded, to think about what you're producing. And like Julia said, what's been most helpful to me is to hear about others going through the same process, especially to hear from senior academics. I'm using senior in air quotes, but senior academics, speaking about the fact that they experience the same struggles, notwithstanding the number of years they've been in this field. And just wanted to quickly jump in on the point about mobilities. I think what Fred said about South-South mobilities, North-South mobilities, it's really important, and it ties well to Tony's question as well. Something that I always emphasize, which I wish we all did more, and I've experienced this in academic circles involving Indian academics. Oftentimes you think of national academic circles as being really united, as being really cogent, and most times they're not. And something I wish we all did was to pass opportunities on, and to cultivate circles ourselves, as opposed to wait for a circle to open up and for us to join this circle. So the more opportunities you're able to pass on, keep all your inboxes on all the time. So just in case anybody has a question, which, as you can clearly see, people always have questions, make yourselves available. How much of a time you have every day to answer someone's question, and that might just be the start of a really meaningful, enduring friendship, which has happened to me with several people. So I would really implore everyone, especially people from the Global South, to always think if you can pass an opportunity on, because your plate is too full, and think about how much is coming out of the act of passing that opportunity on, if you need that ego appeasement for yourself. And on Pranay's point about opportunities, I think they just answered this question already, but something else you could also consider doing is to write to lawyers, to write to people in foundations, because there are several cases where lawyers are willing to shell out lots of money to support young students who want to pursue degrees abroad. Again, I think there is an element of ego appeasement happening there, but so long as it benefits you, there's no harm. So write to lawyers, write to firms, write to foundations, endowment foundations. It's individual people in these endowment foundations, and I think that may also open up funding possibilities.
Thank you, Rekavi. Going back just to the point, when should PhDs or those who finish PhDs feel that their ideas should be out there in the open and that their opinion matters and that they should start, or they are at the right stage to start teaching? Could you share your opinion, Elia, from the professor's side?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, you know, whether you call it, you know, you label it as an imposter syndrome or not, I think everybody has self-doubts in academia. I think only complete assholes have no self-doubt in academia. And sorry for the word. So I think I fully agree that it has to be embraced, but some way to kind of maybe counter it or mitigate it is, first of all, don't take everything so seriously. I mean, a lot of people in academia have this kind of grave, approach to the craft of being an academic. There's a lot of, silly aspects of academia also, right? So some things have to be put in proportion. And I think that helps across the board. More maybe kind of seriously is find your own peer group that makes it easier for you to deal with things. And it can be the group of, your co-PhD candidates. If you're a young faculty, the younger faculty members, even if they're not in our field, you can do it online through Twitter. A lot of young PhD students I see are kind of creating a very nice community on Twitter. And that peer group, I think, is invaluable. And it's more important than reaching out to the most senior person in the field, and writing an email and getting feedback. I think is kind of having the people in your own kind of that you can relate to about the fear of somebody stealing your idea. I think I wouldn't want to live in that fear, because the prospects of somebody actually doing it are quite low. So and then not talking to people or being kind of this in a defensive mode probably is more harm than good. But if you're really worried, so one way is kind of to claim the idea. So write a blog post, put something on SSRN, right? Even if it's not perfect. So that's something that people in the sciences do all of the time. If they want to claim an idea, they put it up and one of the websites, and then it makes it a lot harder to steal. But as I said, don't worry too much about it, because the chances that you're going to encounter it, I think in my experience, are quite low.
There is a really interesting question about the relationship of practice to academia. The person who asked the questions said that he recently started the PhD, and before that had a largely non-academic career. And this person feels that academia does not value practical experience. And so the question is how to successfully switch to academic culture, and how to incorporate this practical experience, and generally what practical experience, what value it has in the academic field. And maybe I would start with Fred with this question.
It's a good question. I think it depends a bit on the country and the academic culture. I think there's more room for this traditionally in the common law and in North American legal academia, definitely. Although it's true that scholarship, legal scholarship is always in search for itself. I mean, it's not very clear to us what legal scholarship is. And one of the things that's happened is a drift away from practice and away from a conception of legal scholars as kind of adjunct to the legal system. So that meant that people who came from practice were, were more in demand in the past, whereas I think today we're interested in people who can bring a more conventionally academic look on things. So, of course, there are positions, I can only speak for North America, but where practical experience is still highly valued, but they're clinical positions, of which there are quite a few, and which can be a way into academia. There's all kinds of clinics in human rights, in immigration law, etc. So that's one area. I mean, one possibility is to make of what might otherwise be a weakness into a strength, right? So theorize your practice, right? I mean, I think there is a degree to which practice is interesting to students, but maybe not so much to academics whose business is with ideas, really. But of course, practice, I mean, the distinction between practice and theory always makes me smile a bit, right? So there's really a practice to theory, and then practice is itself a very theoretical kind of thing. Like, I mean, so I think you could work on that, right? To make but if practice is just details and know-how and networks, etc., it might not be that useful for academia, unless you can give it a kind of more academic twist. But partly when you enter a faculty, you learn the language. When you enter academia, you learn the language. A lot of the language of academia is I wrote a piece on this in relation to judges. It's about pompousness, right? And saying things that are sometimes pretty obvious with an air of solemnity. So you have to go a bit with that, even as you seek to undermine it. But also I think take seriously the invitation to theorize and to understand even the things that seem most obvious to us as in fact relying on all kinds of fossilized assumptions and ideas, right? So yeah.
There is a question about balancing the different activities while we are in the academic career, whereas we should concentrate more on our own project, and how much should we include applying for calls for publications or conference abstracts. So I would ask first, maybe Tejas, what do you think about this, well, let's say work balance for this matter?
Thanks, Barbara. That's a great question. I think Bashak had a post about this recently. I think it's part of the symposium as well, about how about managing time between submissions and doing and recycling abstracts, especially for conferences, and getting feedback for abstracts from people before you submit. But I would say, I think that this goes back to the question about what academic production is and what the role of a researcher is within the academy, or within the academic fraternity, and how much you have to give back to the community that you have entered, like Eliav and Fred have both mentioned earlier. I think a lot of the early career, like the ECR mentality, is about finding your own academic voice, because we're sort of navigating this pathway to figure out the ideas and the belief systems that we hold and how they are shaped by other ideas and influences. So in terms of deciding, for me personally, the way I take a decision about writing back for a call for abstracts or contributing to a book chapter is, in what way will that shape the belief system that I hold today? Or in what way will that contribute to my belief system? Or in what way can I challenge the belief system that's being held by the call for abstracts or the call for papers? And I understand that this puts constraints on time and pressures on time that we sort of have to manage, but I think that's an entirely individual judgment on how much time you're willing to give this. For me, at least, the way the last 1 year has been living in this gig economy of funding and trying to figure out the PhD, it's been more about just doing everything I can, rather than being judicious about or strategic about what I'm doing and what I'm shying away from. And I think that when the pressure comes to do the PhD, or the PhD becomes the central focus, the rest sort of shifts to the margins, but it's equally important to be a part of this fraternity and contribute back. So I think it completely depends from person to person. I know that's unhelpful advice, but it's more of a call to take based on where you are with the projects that you're doing. And to borrow what Elia was saying, juggling different balls in the air and different ideas in the air, and seeing at what point what idea resonates with you and how much you can contribute to that. But yeah.
Barbara, can I add just 30 seconds to this? Because that just, I think, brilliantly answered this question, because it's all like very individualized. But maybe the one thing that one should also consider is, again, what are you planning to do in the future? Like what is your career path? Because I know, for instance, from my German colleagues who know that they have to do Referendariat, it's their like formation for lawyers further. So they are trying to be done with their PhDs as soon as possible, and it makes complete sense. So they don't attend conferences, they don't publish anything on the side. For them, it's important to finish and move further. On the other hand, we, like most of us foreign academics who are in foreign environments, for us, there is no linear path. So we have to think about like how to promote ourselves, how to promote our work, how to sell us. So maybe in this sense, you know, publishing and attending conferences is a good idea. But I think your project should be central all the time.
Thank you for the insight, Julia. I would point out that Barry shared the link to all the symposium articles, which have been collected in one document. So you may find it in the chat as the last comment. And as we are nearing the end of this closing panel discussion, I would close with the question which was specifically addressed to Fred and Elia, which asks, what is the best part in your current career and what drives you most to be a scholar in the field of international law? And Fred, maybe you can go ahead.
Sure, I haven't given much thought to the question. So the best part is, I guess, you know, that things come together after a few years in your career. I mean, there was a time when I you know, didn't quite know where I was headed and wrote on all kinds of different issues. And there's a point when you look back and you say, you kind of finally see the logic to your own work. And this is something I'd like to emphasize. We don't really know what we're doing until it's too late, right? And then you look back and you think, oh, so that's what I was, you know, going on about. And one thing, you know, that's really interesting is there's a huge psychological dimension to a lot of scholarship. And you discover you know, we're all neurotic, and we're dealing with some central anxiety, something that ticks us. And the sooner you understand what that is, the sooner you understand what you stand for intellectually, which in the end is, I think, you know, we can write a lot of things, but I think, and which could be interesting, etc. But in the end, if you look at people who've influenced us very significantly, they generally tended to stand for one big intuition. And so kind of finding what that is for each of us is, I think, really important. So that was the first question. I think that will be my conclusion.
Okay, I think the best thing, you know, it's pretty banal, but it still is, first of all, the freedom to kind of to pursue your interests and your intellectual curiosity, and also interacting with peers. One of the things that I like best is interacting via conferences, on Twitter, in events like this. That's one of the things I like the most. In terms of what drives me as a scholar, so I think many people that go into international law are driven at the first instance from some kind of a frustration with injustice. And this drives a lot of the motivation in the beginning. But I think nowadays what kind of drives me, and it relates to what Fred mentions, is kind of like trying to understand why certain things that don't make sense are perceived as, natural truths. So a lot of my stuff is kind of wondering, why is this, perceived as so obvious when it's like not clear to me at all? So I think I do that more and more in recent years. But yeah, I think we're kind of over time, so I think I will stop here.
Thank you, and thank you all for participating in today's discussion. I think it was really fruitful, and I hope that all our attendees liked that and got answers to their questions. And as Barry said, I hope that this is just the beginning of many of these such discussions. And I wish you all a great afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you are in the world. And this concludes today's panel discussion. Thank you.